I don't talk about this at work. I work with guys who've spent their whole lives in these mountains. Loggers, mostly. Men who've been running chainsaws since they were teenagers, who know every hollow and ridge in this part of West Virginia the way most people know their own neighborhoods. These are not men who scare easy. These are not men who would let you forget it if you told them something had frightened you out in the dark. So I keep it to myself. But it happened. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday night in late October, something happened on the logging road above Spruce Knob that I have not been able to explain, and I have tried every rational angle I know. My name is Daniel. I was 29 at the time. I'd been working timber operations in Pendleton County, West Virginia for about 6 years by then. Good work, hard work, the kind that keeps you honest. Part of my job, a small part, but a regular part, was doing equipment checks on the road graders and skidders we left up on the mountain overnight. Most nights this was completely unremarkable. Drive up, walk the machines, check fluid levels and tire pressure and hydraulic connections, log it in the book, drive back down. 40 minutes start to finish, maybe less if everything looked clean. The haul road we used that season was a private road, cut into the mountain years before I was born. Single lane, steep switchbacks, no guardrail on the drop side. You drove it slow in the daytime. At night you drove it very slow because your headlights only reached so far around each bend and the drop on the right was serious, 200 feet in some sections before you'd hit anything solid. The kind of road where you keep your windows cracked so you can hear if gravel starts going over the edge. I made that drive alone probably 60 times across that season. 60 times. Nothing. Then the 61st. I got up to the equipment yard around 9:30 that night. Later than usual, I'd had a long day felling on the south slope and had stopped in town for dinner before heading up. I remember being tired. Not dangerously tired, just the good heavy kind that comes from real physical work. My legs ached. My shoulders were tight. I wanted to be done and home. The equipment yard was a flat clearing we'd graded out near the top of the ridge, wide enough to park 4 or 5 large machines with room to maneuver. That night there were 2 skidders and the road grader. The boss had talked about sending a second grader up but it hadn't come yet. So 3 machines. 40 minutes. I parked my truck with the headlights pointed into the yard, left them on to give myself working light, and started my walk around on the first skidder. Fluid levels good. Tires good. Hydraulic lines had a slow seep on the left rear fitting that I noted but wasn't critical. I moved to the road grader. The road grader was fine. Everything clean, nothing leaking, blades looked solid. 2 machines down, 1 to go. The second skidder was parked closest to the tree line on the north side of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from the edge of the forest. I'd parked it there myself 2 days before because the ground was more level on that side. I walked toward it, pen and clipboard in hand, flashlight in my jacket pocket. And that's when I noticed the smell. I want to be specific about this because the smell was the first thing. Before any sound, before any movement, before anything else I'm going to tell you, the smell hit me when I was about 10 feet from the second skidder. Something that sat between rot and wet earth and something older than either of those things. Not straight decomposition, I've smelled that plenty, working in the woods. Not a dead animal. This was something else. Something that made the back of my throat close the way it does right before you're sick. Something that made my body want to step backward before my brain had finished processing what I was smelling. I stopped walking. Stood there with my clipboard and looked around the yard. Looked at the tree line. My truck headlights lit the skidder clearly but didn't reach past it. Everything beyond that machine was solid black. The tree line was just darkness and the rough edge where the canopy cut against the sky. I stood there for maybe 15 seconds. Then I made myself walk forward and finish the check. Tire pressure, fluids, hydraulic lines. I wrote the numbers fast, not checking them twice the way I usually would. Everything in me wanted to be back in the cab of my truck with the doors locked. But I was almost done. So I finished. That's when something in the tree line moved. Not branches. Not the tops of trees shifting in wind. Something inside the tree line, something at ground level, something large, shifted its weight. I felt it before I saw it. A displacement of air. A change in the quality of the darkness 30 feet in front of me. The way the shadows seemed suddenly less empty than they had been 5 seconds before. I pulled my flashlight and turned it on the tree line. A beam of solid white light, 30 feet of reach, cutting between the trunks. Nothing. Just trees. Just dark between the trunks. Just the rough texture of bark and the dead leaves of the forest floor going back into black. But the smell got worse. It got significantly worse, as if whatever was producing it had moved closer in the seconds while I was looking. I don't know why I took 3 steps toward the tree line. I've asked myself that probably 1,000 times since. Some part of me wanted to confirm it was nothing. Some part of me needed to close the distance enough to be sure. 3 steps. That was all I took. Then I heard the breathing. Slow. Deep. Completely controlled. The kind of breathing that belongs to something large, not large like a big man, large like an animal that weighs more than my truck. Each inhale was long and deliberate. Each exhale was slow. And it was close. 10 feet inside the tree line, maybe less. Standing in the dark just past where my flashlight beam started to weaken and scatter. I know what a bear sounds like. I have been around black bears my entire working life. I know the huff, the jaw pop, the way they crash and snap when they move through brush. I know what it sounds like when a bear is nervous and what it sounds like when one is aggressive. This was neither of those things. This was patient. This was calm. This was something standing in the dark on the other side of 30 feet of air, breathing slowly, making no move toward me and no move away from me, as if the question of what happened next was not particularly urgent to it. As if it had time. I backed up. 1 step, then another. I kept the flashlight aimed at the tree line and I backed up across the yard until my back touched the front bumper of my truck. Then I got in, shut the door, hit the locks, and sat with the engine running. My hands were shaking. I noticed that the way you notice something at a distance, like it was happening to someone else. I watched the tree line. For 4 minutes, nothing. I remember watching the clock on my dash. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then it stepped out. It came out of the tree line slowly, into the outer edge of my headlight beam, and it stood there. I can tell you what I saw. I can tell you it was upright. I can tell you it was on 2 legs and that its proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't fully process in the moment. The shoulders were too wide and set too high. The arms were long in a way that registered as wrong before I could measure why. It was tall enough that my headlights, which sit roughly 5 feet off the ground on my truck, caught it at mid-torso, which meant its head and shoulders were above the beam, in shadow. I could not see its face. It stood there for what I think was 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then it turned, slowly, and walked back into the trees. No hurry. No crash of brush. Just gone. I drove down that mountain faster than I should have on a road like that. I took 2 of the switchbacks wider than was safe and I didn't care. I got to the county road and I pulled over and I sat there with my hazards on for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive the rest of the way home. I told my boss the next morning that I needed to switch to morning equipment checks. He looked at me for a second. Didn't ask why. Just said okay. The older guys on the crew, the ones who'd worked that mountain for 20, 30 years, one of them caught me in the parking lot that day. Man named Roy, late 50s, gray beard, the kind of quiet that comes from seeing a lot and choosing what to speak about carefully. He said, "You did the night check last Tuesday?" I said yeah. He said, "How far up did you go?" I said, "All the way to the top yard." He nodded. He looked out at the tree line beyond the parking lot for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a reason most of the old-timers won't go up that road after dark." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. He just walked back to his truck, got in, and drove away. I've worked with Roy for 3 more years since then. I've come close to asking him what he knows about that road a dozen times. I never do. Because I think Roy is a man who's made a deliberate choice about what he carries and what he puts down. And some part of me respects that enough to leave it alone. But I still think about those 4 minutes. The engine running. The clock on the dash. The empty tree line. And the thing that had enough patience to wait until I'd almost convinced myself there was nothing there. I've camped alone more than 200 times in my life. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what happened. 200 solo nights in backcountry. The Smokies, the Nantahalas, the Unakas, the Black Mountains. I've camped in weather that kept sensible people indoors for a week. I've camped through 3 days of solid rain when everything I owned was soaked and the trail had turned to a running creek and I kept going because turning back felt worse. I've camped in terrain where a wrong step in the dark means a very long fall, and I've done it calmly and methodically and come home fine every time. I'm telling you all of that because I need you to understand the weight of what I'm about to say. I packed up and left that campsite at 2 in the morning. In the dark. With my tent still half standing because I didn't want to spend another 60 seconds in that clearing. 11 miles back to the trailhead in the dark, alone, moving as fast as I could without running. I don't leave. That's not who I am. That's not been who I am for 15 years of doing this. But I left. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and these mountains have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. My father took me on my first overnight hike when I was 9. By the time I was 16, I was planning and running solo trips on my own. By my mid-20s, it was just part of how I functioned in the world. Work hard during the week, go into the mountains on weekends. Reset. Come back human. I knew the Balsam Ridge Trail in Graham County the way I know most of my regular routes, not perfectly, but well enough. I'd done sections of it twice before, always moving through the area around mile marker 9 without stopping. It had always struck me as slightly odd terrain, a high natural basin, maybe a quarter mile across, the trail running along its eastern edge. A flat area just off trail that hikers had clearly been using as a campsite for years. Stone fire ring, the ground packed smooth from use. I'd always meant to spend a night there. It looked like a good site. It was the 3rd day of a 4-night solo loop in late August. I reached the basin in the mid-afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock, with good light left and no reason to push further. I was making good miles. I was ahead of schedule. I decided to stop. The first thing I noticed when I set up in that clearing was the acoustic quality of the space. I'm going to spend a moment on this because it matters and because I want to be precise. Every natural space has its own acoustic signature, the way sound travels, reflects, gets absorbed. A dense forest dampens sound. A rocky gorge amplifies it. An open field lets it disperse. You develop a feel for it over years of fieldwork and hiking, and after a while you stop noticing it consciously the same way you stop consciously noticing the smell of a familiar room. The basin felt wrong acoustically. Not dramatically wrong. Not something that would have flagged for most people. But the sounds I made, my footsteps, the stakes going into the ground, the zipper on my pack, they sat in the air differently than they should have. Flatter. Closer. Like the sound wasn't traveling the way it should, like it was staying right next to me instead of moving outward. I noted it and let it go. Unusual terrain does unusual things. I set up my tent, a 3-season solo shelter, familiar as a second skin, hung my food bag on a line between 2 beaches 40 feet from camp, cooked a simple dinner on my stove, and read until the light went. I was in my sleeping bag by 8:30 and asleep before 9. I'm a good sleeper in the backcountry. My body knows the sounds of the forest at night, the owls, the small animals moving through leaves, the settling sounds of cooling air. It knows how to filter them, what to elevate and what to let go. I rarely wake before my intended time. I woke at 11:43. I know the exact time because checking my watch is the first thing I do when something wakes me in the field. It's habit, built over years. I want the timestamp. I want the data point. I lay still with my eyes open in the dark and I listened. A voice. Someone was talking outside my tent. Low and steady, maybe 10 feet away, just off to the left side of the tent. Not a shout. Not a call. The register and pace of a normal conversation, the kind of voice you'd use if you were sitting next to someone at a table, talking about something ordinary. I couldn't make out individual words. The shape of speech was there, the rhythm and cadence of language, but the words themselves wouldn't resolve. One voice. No second voice responding. Just the one, continuous, as if it had been going for a while before it woke me. I ran through the explanations fast. Another hiker, phone call, strange signal pocket in the terrain, happens. Hostel. I'd passed the last town had hikers who came in late sometimes, pushed miles into the dark. Could be someone passing through who'd stopped to make a call. But the voice was too close to the trail. Too close to my tent specifically. I reached for my headlamp and knife without sitting up. Both right beside my head, same place every night. The voice stopped. Silence. Total. I waited. My watch said 11:44. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. And then the voice started again. Different side of the tent. The right side now. Same distance, about 10, 12 feet. Same low steady conversational tone. Same indistinct words. Same unbroken rhythm of speech directed at no one, or at nothing, or at something I couldn't hear responding. It had moved around my tent while I was lying there. I am going to tell you exactly what I did because I think my decisions in those moments are important. I didn't panic. I didn't freeze. I turned on my headlamp, gripped my knife in my right hand, and unzipped the tent door in one smooth motion. The clearing was empty. My headlamp swept the fire ring, the tree line, the trail junction beyond, the beech trees where my food bag hung. Everything lit clean and white. Empty ground. Still air. Nothing. I sat in the tent doorway for 5 minutes and let the light reach every corner of that clearing. No one. No movement. No sound. I told myself, hypnagogic hallucination. There is a documented phenomenon where the brain, caught between sleep and waking, generates sounds, voices specifically, that feel completely external and completely real. It happens to sane, healthy people. It happens more often in unusual acoustic environments. I had already noted that the basin felt acoustically strange. I had an explanation. I took it. I zipped the tent, put the knife within reach, and lay back down. I was awake for another 40 minutes before I finally drifted off. 1:47 in the morning. My watch said 1:47 when I opened my eyes again. The voice was back. Not beside the tent. Not at 10 or 12 feet. Above the tent. Directly above the tent fabric, close enough that I could hear the texture of it, the weight of breath behind it, the physical reality of something producing sound from a distance of maybe 2 feet above the nylon, face down toward me, speaking in that same low steady tone. I did not move. I lay on my back with my eyes open in the dark inside my tent and I stared at the ceiling fabric 18 inches above my face and I listened to a voice coming from directly above me talk in the cadence of conversation with no words I could understand. 40 seconds. I counted. In those 40 seconds I made a very clear decision. I sat up. I broke down my sleeping pad and stuffed it half into my pack. I grabbed my sleep quilt and compressed it without rolling it properly. I unclipped my tent poles from the stakes without taking the tent down fully, left the fabric half collapsed on the ground. I put on my boots without lacing them completely. And I walked out of that campsite. Not running. Walking fast, deliberate, headlamp off until I cleared the basin. I don't know exactly where that instinct came from, the same place Marcus's instinct came from, maybe. The same something that says, don't show it where you are. Don't give it your light. Just move. I got past the trail junction at the north edge of the basin and turned my headlamp on, and I moved for 4.5 hours straight. 11 miles. Trailhead at 4:32 in the morning. I sat in my car with all the doors locked and watched the sky go from black to gray to pale pink, and I did not sleep. I've told this story 3 times since then. The first 2 people I told it to, experienced hikers, people I trust, listened without comment and said nothing that helped. One suggested animals. One suggested I'd been more tired than I realized. The third person was a woman named Helen. 62 years old. She's been hiking the Nantahalas and the surrounding ranges for over 20 years. She knows that terrain the way some people know music, intuitively, structurally, in her body. I told her the whole story. Everything. The acoustic strangeness, the voice, where it moved, where it ended up. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me where exactly it happened. What section of trail? What landmark? I told her, Balsam Ridge, mile marker 9, the high basin. She looked at me. Her expression didn't shift dramatically. It just settled. Like a door closing quietly. She said, I know that basin. I asked her if she'd had an experience there. She said, I don't camp in that basin. I won't go through it after noon. I've made that a rule for myself, and I don't explain it to people I hike with. I asked her why not. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and looked out the window of the diner we were sitting in. Then she said, because explaining it means thinking about it. And thinking about it means remembering it in detail. And I decided a long time ago that some things are better kept blurry. I've thought about that answer more than almost anything anyone has ever said to me. I think she's right. I think there is a version of engaging with what happened in that basin that leads somewhere I don't want to go. I think there is a reason that both the woman who told me she avoids that basin and the logger named Roy who wouldn't explain what lives on that road above Spruce Knob made the same choice, to put it down. To keep it at the edge of focus. To not look directly at it. But here's the thing I can't get past. Whatever was above my tent that night, it was speaking. In the shape of language. In the cadence and rhythm of human speech, with breath behind it, with the physical weight of a real voice producing real sound. It was not mimicking something it had heard. Or maybe it was. Maybe it had heard enough of us, over enough time in those old mountains, to know what our communication sounds like. What it couldn't get right was the words. And I have spent 3 years trying to decide which possibility frightens me more. That it was trying to speak to me and couldn't. Or that it knew exactly what it was saying. And I just couldn't understand. I want to say something before I start. I am not a superstitious person. I have a master's degree in wildlife biology. I have spent the better part of 15 years doing field research in remote terrain across 6 different states. I have been charged by a grizzly bear in Alaska, bitten by a rattlesnake in Utah, and I once spent 4 days stranded in the Ozarks after a flash flood took out the only trail I knew. None of those things broke me. None of those things left any lasting mark on how I think or sleep or move through the world. What happened to me on the trail above Bluff Creek Hollow in Yancey County, North Carolina, 2 years ago, that left a mark. I'm still not sure I understand what I saw. I've tried to explain it with the tools I have, the scientific framework I've spent 15 years building, and every explanation I come up with has a hole in it. A place where the logic stops and something else begins. Something I don't have a name for and don't particularly want one for. Here is what happened. It was the last week of September. I was conducting a solo survey of a camera trap network I'd set up the previous spring as part of a long-term black bear population study. 11 cameras, spread across an 11-mile loop of trail in a stretch of old-growth forest above 4,000 feet. I'd done this survey route 4 times already that year. I knew every section of it. I knew where the trail crossed the creek twice, where the blowdown from the previous winter slowed your pace, where the old hemlock grove made it dark even on bright days. I started at first light and worked north to south, pulling memory cards and checking camera housing. Good day. No rain, moderate temperatures, good visibility. By 2 in the afternoon I was into the back half of the loop, on the section that climbs steeply through a long stretch of old red oak and beech. That section of trail doesn't see much traffic. It's not maintained. It's not on any recreational map. You have to know it's there to find it. In 4 surveys I had never once encountered another person on that stretch. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, I came around a long left-hand bend in the trail and stopped walking. There was a woman about 90 yards ahead of me. She was standing in the middle of the trail, facing away from me, completely motionless. My first thought was, lost hiker. It happens in that terrain more than people realize. The tree cover is thick enough that GPS gets unreliable, the ridgelines all look similar, and people make wrong turns and end up much deeper in than they intended. I've encountered disoriented hikers before. The protocol is straightforward: approach calmly, assess their condition, help them reorient. I called out. Hello? Are you okay? My voice went up the trail and into the canopy and came back as nothing. She didn't move. I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I started walking toward her, slowly. I was running through the checklist in my head: signs of hypothermia, signs of disorientation, signs of injury. She was wearing light clothing, which concerned me. White or very pale gray top. Dark pants. No jacket I could see. No pack. No gear of any kind. No gear. That was the first thing that caught in my mind and didn't let go. You don't get to that section of trail without either knowing exactly where you're going or making a serious navigation error. Either way, you'd have gear. You'd have a bag. At minimum a water bottle. She had nothing. I got to about 60 yards and stopped. Something was wrong with the way she was standing, and I was only now close enough to see it clearly. Her feet were together. Not slightly apart the way a person naturally stands, not offset the way you stand on uneven ground. Together. Perfectly together, flat, parallel, like she was standing on a tile floor in a shopping mall, not on a root-covered trail that was angled at maybe 15 degrees and covered in loose rock and wet leaves. You can't stand like that on terrain like that. It's not physically natural. Your feet find their own position, make their own small adjustments, compensate for the surface. It happens automatically. You can't override it without thinking very hard about it, and even then, you'd wobble. She wasn't wobbling. I stood at 60 yards and I looked at her for a long time, and I tried to make my brain accept that this was a normal situation. Lost hiker. Shock. Possible medical episode. There are neurological events that can cause a person to freeze. I ran through all of it. But my feet didn't move. Eventually I made them move. I walked forward again. Slowly. At about 45 yards, I stopped again without deciding to. Because I realized something. In the time I had been standing there, probably 4 or 5 minutes by that point, she had not moved. Not even the small involuntary movements that a living human body makes constantly. No shift of weight. No rise and fall of breathing that you can see from the back. No turn of the head. Nothing. The word that came into my head, and I did not invite it and I did not want it, was, placed. She looked like something that had been placed on the trail. I don't know how else to describe it and I've tried 100 times. I called out again. Nothing. I clapped my hands together once, hard. The sound cracked through the forest. She turned her head. Just her head. Nothing else. Her body didn't move, her shoulders didn't turn, her feet didn't shift. Just her head rotating slowly on her neck until she was looking back over her left shoulder at me. I stopped breathing. Her face was, I've spent 2 years trying to find the right words for this. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to make it into something it wasn't. But the honest answer is that her face looked wrong in a way I could not and still cannot fully articulate. It wasn't disfigurement. It wasn't injury. It was something about the proportions. The way the features related to each other. The depth of the eyes relative to the cheekbones. Like the geometry of a human face was almost right but had been assembled by something that had studied faces without ever having one. Like a translation that's technically accurate but somehow off in every sentence. She looked at me. I looked at her. That lasted maybe 5 seconds. Maybe less. It felt much longer. Then she stepped off the trail. Into the trees on the left side. 1 step, 2 steps, and gone. No sound. I need you to understand that part. That section of trail runs through dry leaf litter 6 inches deep. Sticks, root tangles, loose rock. Every step I'd taken that day had been loud. Every deer and squirrel and bird I'd tracked over 15 years of fieldwork had made noise moving through cover like that. She made no sound. Not one leaf. Not one twig. Nothing. I stood on the trail for a very long time. I want to tell you I walked over to where she'd stepped off and looked into the trees. I want to tell you I was professional about it, clinical, did a proper sweep of the area and found a rational explanation. I didn't. I finished my survey and I walked out of those woods at a pace I'm not comfortable calling anything other than a controlled panic, and I checked behind me every 30 seconds for the remaining 4 miles of trail. When I got back to my truck I sat in it and I wrote down everything in my field notebook. Time, location, description. Every detail while it was still sharp. Then I went home and I pulled the memory card from camera trap 7. Camera 7 was positioned about 230 yards back down the trail from where I'd seen her, at a gap in the vegetation where a small game trail crossed the main trail. Good detection angle. I'd gotten solid footage from that camera all season. I put the card in my laptop. The camera had logged 11 trigger events that day. 9 were deer. 1 was what looked like a bobcat moving through fast. 1 was at 2:47 in the afternoon. At 2:47, I was still about 20 minutes back down the trail. I hadn't yet rounded the bend where I would see her at 3:15. I was still pulling a card from camera 5. The 2:47 event, something triggered the motion sensor and passed in front of the camera. The image was blurred. The camera had a half-second shutter lag and whatever passed in front of it moved through the detection zone faster than the shutter could capture it cleanly. What I could make out from the image, something pale. Moving from left to right across the frame. Which meant it was moving south on the trail. Which was the same direction I was traveling. Which meant that at 2:47 in the afternoon, something pale was moving south on that trail, ahead of me, toward the bend where I would find a pale figure standing motionless 28 minutes later. I've looked at that image hundreds of times. I've zoomed in and adjusted the exposure and run it through every enhancement I know. I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't a deer, wrong shape, wrong height in the frame. It isn't a bear. It isn't light artifact or lens flare. What it is, I cannot tell you. The sheriff's department wasn't interested. No missing persons report matched the description. The Forest Service knew of no permitted researchers or survey crews working that area that day. I've asked every colleague I have who works that region. I've checked with the local hiking clubs, the hunting clubs, the trail maintenance volunteers. Nobody knows who she was. Nobody knows what she was doing up there without gear, without making sound, with her feet together on a slope trail, turning only her head to look at me with a face that was almost right. I still do fieldwork in the Appalachians. I still run camera trap surveys. I still go back into deep forest alone and I still do my job. But I don't go back to Bluff Creek Hollow. And when I review camera footage now, when I'm sitting at my laptop going through trigger events one by one, I always feel something I never used to feel before. I feel like I'm hoping I won't recognize anything. That I'll get through the whole card and every frame will be a deer, a coyote, a bird. That I won't pull up a blurred pale shape moving fast through the frame. Moving toward wherever I'm going to be in 28 minutes. I haven't found another image like that one. But I still check. Every time.